Hey guys, so every February, we now in America celebrate what is known as Black History Month. And part of what has changed, I guess, probably in recent decades is the highlighting of actual heroes from American history, incredible black heroes going all the way back, maybe even prior to the Civil War, looking at some very significant American heroes. Today, it's really much more of a narrative of a victimization of America being racist and evil. Instead of highlighting black heroes, it's really, let's slam America during this month.
Yeah, I mean, Black History Month has really been, I guess, perverted into kind of this propaganda time for kind of the woke, radical left who want to drive division and really want to kind of foment social change, and they use this as a springboard to do that. But if you go back to the origins of Black History Month, you can look to one of a really strong early black historian named Carter Woodson. We actually have a portrait of him right here. He did a lot of phenomenal work in really the early 1900s on recovering, documenting, and spreading kind of awareness of the role that African Americans played throughout American history. And in 1926, he dedicates a week to Black history, and that later becomes Black History Month, but it all goes back to Carter Woodson. And so for this Black History Month, we thought it would be a good idea to go back and let's look at the true stories of African Americans in America's history, because there's so many heroes. In fact, you can't tell the story of America unless you look at the black heroes, because guess what? They're American heroes too. And so we have artifacts from so many of their lives that really paint a different picture than what a lot of times we hear today.
Yeah, so generally looking back at some of these incredible American heroes, you recognize that there was a great diversity of where some of these heroes came from, because there were some incredible black heroes who were born into free families. There were some who were actually here as slaves and they got their freedom. And so there's a diversity of the stories, how it unfolds, but what is significant is that they were incredible contributors to the cause of America, to liberty, to whatever the case might be, depending on their specific stories. With all that being said, it is a contradiction from, for example, like the modern narrative. This is a print of the 1619 Project done by the New York Times. And the 1619 Project highlights the fact that, or the accusation at least, is that America really was birthed as America on the back of slaves. And everything about America has been slavery. In fact, the American Revolution was a revolution that was birthed in trying to protect slavery. And that's why we fought a revolution to maintain slavery in America. Now, that on its surface is just incredibly dumb. The notion that we're fighting to maintain slavery, because we've talked about before, if you go back and look at Thomas Jefferson's original draft of the Declaration of Independence, the largest grievance in this declaration, his original draft, was a grievance against the slave trade, against slavery, arguing for the humanity of slaves in general. There's nowhere in the Declaration an argument actually for slavery, saying, well, we're separating from the king because we want to protect and maintain slavery. That's not historically accurate on any level. But again, this is part of the modern narrative that we are hearing a lot of the negative things about America. And a lot of the negative things we're hearing are just blatant lies. And so one of the things that Carter Woodson did was not only recapture some of these stories, but in recapturing some of these stories, a lot of the stories that are being recaptured or that we want to tell are actually stories that have original documents to them. And so one of the things we've told people for years is don't take our word for it. Go back and look this up for yourself. And these stories, for the most part, are pretty easily available and accessible, such as if we start with the American Revolution, if we're going to highlight heroes of American history, some of these black heroes from American history, looking at the Revolution, there's actually been entire books written highlighting the contribution to black Americans just from the Revolution alone.
Yeah, and actually we have this book right here. This is a modern reprint. We have the original, which we'll show you as well, but this is a book called The Colored Patriots, The American Revolution by black historian William Nell. Nell, in the kind of mid-1800s, really led the charge of recovering and preserving the stories of the heroes, black heroes from the American Revolution, because there was several thousand, I think it's estimated anywhere from 5,000 to 9,000 African American soldiers in the Continental Army who fought. They actually generally had on average the longest period of enlistment out of any kind of portion of the Continental Army. Oftentimes they served the entire duration of the war. I mean, as you look at the end of the war, the most skilled, trained, experienced soldiers are the African American soldiers underneath George Washington's command, which is interesting to see. But in his book, he literally tells the story of hundreds of these guys, what they did, where they were at, why they were significant. And actually, on the cover of this one, it's got this gentleman right here. His name is Crispus Attucks, and this is during the Boston Massacre. And Nell makes the point that the literally the first blood that was shed in the American Revolutionary struggle was Crispus Attucks, who was helping lead kind of the Patriot group that day at the Boston Massacre, and he was likely one of, if not the first person who was killed by the British during that incident.
Yeah, and John Adams points out, actually at the end of the Revolution, John Adams says the most significant moment that led to independence, that kind of birthed the Revolution. He said it wasn't the shot heard around the world, and he goes through several major battles. It wasn't, right, so it wasn't Lexington Green, it wasn't Concord, but he goes through and lists several battles that might have been, right, the moment for America to really become America. He said it was none of those. He said, actually, it goes back when the first blood was shed at King Street. And King Street is where the Boston Massacre took place. And actually, this is a picture done from a lithograph. There were many lithographs done highlighting Crispus Attucks. And so it's very evident. This is a black man. Even in this lithograph, there were early paintings done. And again, those paintings and lithographs, it was evident there was a black man there. Crispus Attucks had been known to be somebody who early on was in slavery. He escaped to freedom in the North. And then as a freeman in the North, he was a sailor. And that day, he was with other Americans protesting some of the tyranny, the oppression of the British, what was going on. And when the British fired a volley into the crowd, he was one of the 3 individuals that was killed that day at the Boston Massacre. And there were 8 others wounded, 2 died shortly after, but he was one of those first that was killed. And it was reported that he was the first who had shed blood in the cause for liberty. Now, this is, again, worth noting. If we talk about where did the revolution begin, it's pretty well documented that the first blood that was shed was the blood from the Boston Massacre, and arguably the first person killed there was a black patriot. So the American Revolution began with the death of a black patriot, and we literally can go through nearly every single battle, every single major moment in the American Revolution and highlight some of the black heroes, but we want to highlight some of the individuals that we actually have some documentation. We have some signatures from some of these guys who were part of major battles or major moments, so we want to tell some of those stories along the way as well. Okay, so shortly after, you have Lexington Green, the shot heard around the world. By the way, the individual 73 Americans who were there against more than 700 British were from the church of the Reverend Jonas Clark, and there were black and white soldiers there that day fighting. Again, this is well documented. The British go from Lexington Green, they go to Concord Bridge, and after Concord Bridge, the Americans meet them, they kind of repel the British turn and march back to Boston. Once they get back to Boston, a couple weeks later, you have the Battle of Bunker Hill, also known as the Battle of Breed's Hill. During the Battle of Bunker Hill, the British charge the American line, and the Americans are able to repel them the first charge up this hill. The British, even though British suffered heavy casualties during this time, the British regroup and they charge the hill a second time. The Americans repel them a second time. The British gather a third time for a third charge. They charge the hill, and it was reported that the Americans started running out of ammunition, running low on ammunition, so they weren't able to stop this third charge of the British. But as the British are leading the charge, there was one American who did have a shot left, and this American was Peter Salem. This American patriot raised up his musket, shot the British officer leading the charge, and when he shot Major Pitcairn, the officer leading the charge, it effectively stopped the British charge. The Americans were able to get away and live to fight another day. So this patriot who saved the day was the hero of the Battle of Bunker Hill. Well, Peter Salem was a black man. He was the individual who shot the British officer, stops the British charge, saves the day for the Americans to get away and fight another day. This is the only known signature of Peter Salem on any document.
Yeah, it's right here, and you can see it's actually his mark right there, so that X, and then his name is written right there, Peter Salem. But this is to our knowledge, the only known surviving document with his signature on it. And it's actually very interesting because this is even still during the Revolutionary War. This is 1781. And he's actually, along with these 2 other gentlemen, promising to pay back a rather substantial loan. I think it's over 1,000 pounds. Yep, over 1,000 pounds worth, which is a ton of money during that time, which even speaks to the fact that in addition to being a war hero, he was also very much financially active, had property, was able to engage in business and commerce. And so it was very interesting. Peter Salem later retires, spends kind of the rest of his life working on his own property up north. And so very interesting. But this document, the only known surviving document signed by Peter Salem, the hero of the Battle of Bunker Hill.
And this is still early on in the American Revolution. So as mentioned, we can list from nearly every single major encounter, major battle of the Revolution, we can list some of the black heroes. And this is something that actually you can get online. You can find William Nell's book. It's also, I believe, available on Google Books, so you actually can read it online. You can download a PDF. You can go through, and he highlights some of these black heroes from some of these major battles. But as you go through, literally from 1776, 1777, you can go all the way through tracking some of these incredible contributions made by these black patriots in the cause for liberty. Again, speaking of some of these original documents, what's the next one?
Yeah, so this one right here is another black soldier from the Revolutionary War. This is a letter written by Lemuel Haynes. Now, Lemuel Haynes served underneath George Washington and actually really appreciated his time serving underneath Washington because he later became a pastor. And as a pastor, significantly, he was a pastor over integrated churches, black and white, up north. And so as a pastor, he would routinely preach sermons about George Washington, I think on his birthday, the anniversary of his birthday. And so this is a letter by Lemuel Haynes. I mean, he was one of the most influential African pastors in the North during the period after the Revolutionary War. And I mean, very active. You can read several of his sermons. I think he was the first African American to receive a degree of higher education. And then additionally, the first one to have one of his sermons published, which we have those in the collection as well. I mean, a very, very significant and influential figure in this revolutionary and then kind of federal period after the war.
And understand some of the complexity and diversity of American history too at the time. So his family had died when he was young, and one of the neighbors more or less took him in and said, hey, come live with us, work with us for several years, we'll take care of you. So in essence, he became an indentured servant, right? And in essence of what happened, he was not a slave, but he got free, and I'm saying free of the indenture. He completed the indenture in 1774. Well, this is when tensions are heating up with the Revolution. He decides he wants to get involved and help in the cause of liberty as a free man now. So he became part of what was known as the Minutemen, the Massachusetts Minutemen. He's one of these guys who's ready at a moment's notice to go out and fight for the cause of liberty. And then during the course of the Revolution, he does serve under George Washington. So a lot of noted heroes along the way. And really the reason this guy was noted is because afterwards he becomes a pastor. We actually over on the side have one of his Bibles, has his signature in the front of it. So some very cool things from these heroes. But again, as you track through the Revolution, we can highlight black hero after black hero after black hero. What I would point out is worth noting is if you go to the end of the Revolution, one of our favorite stories is of a gentleman named James Armistead. And specifically, James Armistead was a slave in Virginia in 1781. Benedict Arnold, who had been the famous American general, then became the famous traitor to the British, became a British general. As a British general, he led the British charge against Richmond, Virginia. And when Richmond fell in January of 1781, James Armistead was from the area, and James saw Richmond fall, and James thought, I don't want to see the British have victory in this war. I saw them conquer my town, and I don't like what I'm seeing. He went to his master and asked his master if he could go and sign up, volunteer to fight in the cause for liberty. And his master knew that the law said at the time, if you fight for a year, you can have your freedom. His master said, that's fine. If you want to go fight, you can go sign up and fight. So with his master's blessing, he goes to sign up to fight for the cause of liberty. Now at the time, he was a slave. As he goes to sign up, he ends up being assigned under the Marquis de Lafayette. So French Major General Marquis de Lafayette was someone that Washington had early on given him the task of tracking the British movement, and specifically the movement of the British officers. He wanted to know where the officers are going, what they're doing, because what was known was if you could capture, for example, Lord Cornwallis, the commander of all the British forces, then you could get a surrender of the British forces and in the American Revolution. So Lafayette is tracking the movement of the British officers, and the way that Lafayette does this, one of the things he does is he has a spy ring. And spy rings were not totally uncommon in the American Revolution. We've probably heard of things like the Culper spy ring. Well, spy rings were something that were utilized at times. In fact, Abigail Adams actually led a spy ring of women in the American Revolution where women would try to gather information. Anyway, all to say, a lot of spy rings. Lafayette's spy ring was composed primarily of black patriots. And the reason was Lafayette knew that black patriots would be able to go into the British camp pretending to be escaped slaves, and they could gather information, report back to Lafayette. So when James Armistead decides he wants to serve the cause of liberty, he gets assigned under Lafayette, and Lafayette tells him, hey, the way you can help us the most is if you would go into the British camp here in Richmond, because that's where he is, go to this British camp, pretend to be an escaped slave, gather intel, and come back and report to me. So that's what James does. James goes into the British camp, starts gathering information, and goes back and reports and gets word back to Lafayette what's going on. There's actually some very interesting letters from Lafayette to Washington where Lafayette talks about he's got spies in the British camp and they're gathering him information. And so we know this was part of what was happening. The letter that's the most interesting is Lafayette tells Washington, remember I told you I have a new spy who's the most effective spy, the best spy I've ever had. He just got me word that Lord Cornwallis is moving with several thousand of his men, and they're going to Yorktown. Lafayette tells Washington, this might be the very moment we've waited for, that we can capture Cornwallis. We might can end the revolution if we can do this. Well, in effect, that's what happens. Washington moves his troops. They surround Yorktown, and there's a lot of providence involved because strong storm comes in and it blows the British fleet out. It actually helps blow the French fleet in, so Cornwallis is totally surrounded. Again, there's more details which are even more incredible, but for the short of the story, Washington ultimately ends up capturing Cornwallis. It ends the revolution. Well, the only reason Washington knew where he was the work of this black spy, James Armistead. And what is incredible about this is if you look purely at the revolution, not only can we highlight almost every single major battle, a black hero from that battle, specifically if you look at the Boston Massacre, where the revolution arguably began, because that's when the first blood was shed, to the end of the revolution with the surrender of Cornwallis, the revolution started with the death of a black patriot. The revolution was won because of the intelligence, the spy work of a black patriot. You can't even fully tell the story of American history, of the American Revolution, without the contributions of black patriots. And today, we simply don't hear about these incredible heroic contributions. And when you have things like the 1619 Project saying that we want to highlight the contributions of black Americans, I would just genuinely want to know, why are you not including the incredible contributions of so many of these black heroes from the American Revolution, the American War for Independence, or even the Civil War? So many times where black patriots in incredible bravery and courage and heroism stepped up to do things for the cause of liberty, for the cause of equality and freedom. Well, those aren't the stories that are being highlighted, and yet this is some of the most significant things of black history contributions to American history that today we simply don't know. And we haven't even gotten to some of these other things. So Jonathan, let's talk about this for a second, because as far as American history, this is a pretty significant moment in American history.
Yeah, this right here is actually an attack ad that was taken out against John Hancock, right? John Hancock, governor of Massachusetts. He's the guy with the big signature on the Declaration of Independence, one of the leading founding fathers. And this is actually him right here. But what's he doing here? This is an image of a equality ball that he hosted in Boston in the early 1790s. And this guy right here is actually a gentleman by the name of Paul Coffey. He was a free African-American merchant and actually probably the richest black man in America during the Revolutionary War period. And so John Hancock, who was also a big merchant in Boston, was friends with Paul Coffey and hosted this equality ball to celebrate the accomplishments of Mr. Cuff and the other members of the African-American community in Boston and the surrounding area. But Paul Coffey was a big patriot for the American Revolution as well. He helped get supplies. He helped run British blockades. He was a very significant figure and really helped lead the way in increasing kind of legal protections for African Americans in Boston. And Boston led the world, actually, in securing liberty and emancipation and abolition. Actually, it becomes the first sovereign political entity that we have on record in the modern world to entirely extinguish slavery. So in 1776, right, there's the Declaration of Independence. 1780, they have a new constitution, which in effect legally frees everybody. 1783, they have a series of court cases which kind of confirm that. But by the time that you get to the first federal census in 1790, Massachusetts is the only state that has 0 slaves left. Now, 1780, this is 53 years before England abolishes slavery, which is generally regarded as the first kind of major nation to end slavery in the modern world. Massachusetts has them beat by 53 years. But 1619 Project doesn't talk about that. And it's also worth noting that many of the northern states were very closely following Massachusetts. Vermont in that first federal census had only 17 slaves waiting for emancipation. And by 1804, every single northern state had passed laws for either the immediate or gradual abolition of slavery, which represents the largest block of voluntary manumissions anywhere in the world. I mean, that was about 50% of the American people had decided that slavery was a bad thing. We're going to institute legal legislation that would reduce it, restrict it, and promote emancipation. Paul Coffey was a leading figure kind of in that movement. We also have another amazing document from another great black patriot leader in the early years of America. This document is signed by a gentleman by the name of Wentworth Cheswell. Now, he has an amazing story, doesn't he?
He does. So Wentworth Cheswell, today a lot of people have heard the name Paul Revere. Paul Revere, right, the guy who rode to warn the Americans, the British are coming. If you know history, Paul Revere wasn't the only guy that rode that night. We know William Dawes rode that night. There was others as well. But every time the British were making a major movement toward an American town or location, there were people riding to warn Americans ahead of the British. The British are coming. In fact, in American history, there's some very famous rides made by women, for example. Sybil Ludington made one of these famous Paul Revere kind of rides. Well, Wentworth Cheswell is another one of those Americans who made a famous Paul Revere kind of ride, riding to warn Americans ahead of the British when they were coming that, hey, the British are coming, you guys be ready, be prepared. What's significant about Wentworth Cheswell is Wentworth Cheswell was one of the early black political leaders of that time. Specifically, he was elected to different public offices for 49 years, and it was in a white community. So this is a black political leader being elected by white people in a white community. This is very significant historically, again, because it's different than the narrative we hear today from things like the 1619 Project. And here's the big picture we want to get into. As we talk about every February, right, it being Black History Month, it's great that we can have a time in America that we can say, let's highlight some heroes that maybe don't always get the recognition they deserve. With that being said, the way that much of the modern story is told is not being honest about who some of these heroes were, about the contributions being made, or even about what America looked like at that time. And so what we would encourage you is make sure that as you are learning some of these heroes, go back to original documents. Don't just look at modern professors. Don't just look at modern works. Really go back and look at original historic documents, because you do have things like this book from William Nell. And this isn't the only one. There are many books back there. And this was at a time when the abolition movement in America in the mid-1800s was growing, and they were actually trying to highlight the equality, the contributions of some of these black Americans. And so they told very honest stories about some of these heroes from the American Revolution. You can go back and see who some of these people were and really recognize the true history of America. It's very different than much of the modern narrative. And with that being said, if you want to find more on the WallBuilders website, wallbuilders.com, there's a place you can go. There's a link for original resources. There's a section for Black history. We have links actually to a lot of these documents. You can go and read them online for yourself. We also have the book, The American Story, that we highlight and tell some of these stories. We have it footnoted back to original sources as well. There are some great places to go to find out the true story of America. We would just encourage you, as Black History Month every February is being celebrated around America, don't get caught up by this wokest propaganda from these leftist professors about how America is fundamentally terrible, racist, and evil. Unquestionably, America's not perfect. There's been some dark days in America's history, but the reality of America is America was on the forefront of celebrating the contributions of these black patriots and really recognizing the equality of individuals, as the Declaration said. This Black History Month, go back and learn the true story of American history. Hey guys, if you want to find out more of some of the great heroes from American history, specifically some of the incredible black patriots from American history, there's a couple of really good resources we have at wallbuilders.com. One of them is called Setting the Record Straight, American History in Black and White. And this looks at a lot of the heroes in the middle of kind of the Civil War era and looking at Reconstruction at the end of the Civil War, some of the early black leaders, black congressmen, black senators, really the political shift and movement that birthed the Republican Party. And it really just goes through the details, the history of America in regard to some of this that we largely don't hear today. This is a great way to go back and learn some of the history, again, around the Civil War, Reconstruction era, birth of the Republican Party, highlighting who the heroes were and what really happened at that time.